Family history is full of all sorts of twists and turns. My particular family history was hidden by my parents, aunties and uncles from myself and my brother and my sister, which probably made us more inquisitive about what had actually gone on. These days, of course, with Ancestry.com and the internet in general, we are able to find out a lot of stuff that perhaps our parents never even knew about, let alone making a decision not to share it. So we can go online and find out things about our convicts and our free settlers and all sorts of other people who I have discovered exist in my family. Catholics and Protestants, people in jail committing all sorts of crimes, and even getting decapitated. The stuff is just fascinating, and it adds to a rich history. But starting off though with my history is, well, maybe not so insignificant either. So I just want to share a bit of all that information with you. I was born at the Alfred Hospital. Back in the day it was called the Margaret Coles Private Hospital, whatever, part of the Alfred Hospital. It's now the Alfred Car Park, so it's long gone, but I'm still here. Our first house that I lived in was 51A Toorak Road, and we were right over the road from the Toorak Drive-In Theatre. We used to sneak in there and watch movies. We used to drive in with our parents and watch movies. We generally had a really good time in Toorak Road, East Hawthorn. Dad was a builder. He'd grown up in a building family. His father was a builder, and his father, my great-grandfather, was into building just generally. So probably started with my grandfather, the whole building thing, and my youngest son is also now a builder. So there's 4 generations of us. Here's Daniel working up the Skyreach boom lift. My dad took it on in a really serious way with a building partner, had their own firm, and did all sorts of houses, renovations and all sorts of stuff, which I eventually took on. My mother had come over from Tasmania with her parents and her 2 sisters. My father was born down in Chelsea, down on the bay, but his parents had also come over from Tasmania. So 1 generation apart, they're all Tasmanians. My parents met through their cousins who lived in Paran. The 2 cousins, just by chance, were going to the same church, and through one of the various meetings, that's where they met. Fell in love pretty quickly from what I hear, and got married at the Spring Street Mission Church. Mum was very work orientated. I suppose they both were. Dad had just come out of the war. We're talking about the late 40s here, 48, 49. Their dating all went very quickly, engagement and the wedding was all over and done with, and they were into happy married life very quickly. My mother was very ambitious about buying and selling houses, so I think she saw a bit of an opportunity and wanted to try and make a bit of money from Dad being the builder and she being the pusher of my father to do more building. They first moved into a house in Paran, and then the second house they had, I think it even might have been the 3rd house they had, was the one that I was born into. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the sequence of events that my mum was really interested in the buying and selling of houses. So they were in house number 3 by the time I came along. So we moved around a lot in the first few years. My brother was at Christchurch Grammar, and I'm not sure where my sister was at school in those very early days. She ended up at Malvern Girls Grammar. But I went through the state school system at Auburn South, and then we shifted to South Yarra for a short time. So I went to South Yarra Primary. Then we moved to the Murrumbina Carnegie area, and I went to Murrumbina Primary. And then we moved to Ashwood, and I went to Ashwood Primary. And then I was in grade 1. And that's how it all began. So my brother and sister were at the same school. I was being shifted here, there and everywhere. Mum settled down with her desire to move around so much, and we all settled down in Ashwood. I went to Ashwood Primary, Ashwood High School. Colin also went to Ashwood High, and Joy to Malvern Girls Grammar. So that was our life for about 15 years in Ashwood. Going to Chadstone Baptist Church and doing all sorts of things with school and having a generally a good time. And there you go, there's the old place. 19 Raymond Street, Ashwood. Goodness gracious. Around the corner from Raymond Street is Ashwood High School, where I went to school for many, many years and played in this performing arts centre. This is where I learnt to play the trumpet, where I played the trumpet and went on to do all sorts of other things and had a great time with all sorts of kids. I used to work in a milk bar that was just back here on holidays and that, stacking up milk bottles. Over the street was the creek. We used to play down in there. It's all covered up now. The grandparents on the Oliver side of my family lived in Chelsea. As I said before, they'd come over from Tasmania. They were both born in Tasmania. And my grandfather, Wesley Gordon, was a carpenter, come general businessman, a very independent kind of fellow, so I am told. Through the newspaper cuttings, I found out that he was quite involved in developing the housing of Chelsea and what we now call Bond Beach. He had an estate agency on one side of the Chelsea railway station, and on the other side he had a factory outlet, store, come whatever, for his furniture and other business outlets that he ran. So he's quite a bit of a businessman with his brother, his elder brother. They called themselves the Oliver brothers, and there may have been a few other family members involved in that as well. So this is all before my dad came along. My dad might have been a young boy back then, but he had his own building firm, estate agency. My grandmother used to walk the streets of Chelsea collecting rents. So this is all before the Depression, back in the 1920s mainly. They had really good cars. They loved photography, so we have a few photographs of what they got up to. But one of the main things my grandfather did, along with my grandmother, was to develop the housing estate called Broadway. Broadway housing development was in the what we now know as Bond Beach. Back then, there was no Bond Beach railway station. So I'm pretty sure that my grandfather, being the sort of entrepreneurial type, wanted to develop a new station, a new suburb, all to feed into his estate. And he became a member, secretary, and finally the president of the Bondi Railway Station Committee. So they were putting pressure on state government to develop a new railway station down on the peninsula just before the Chelsea one, which is on the Frankston line. Eventually, over a couple of years, they actually got that to happen, and the Bondi area was developed. But of course there was a problem with the name because of Sydney's Bondi Beach, And so because the name was already taken by Sydney, government authorities, Postmaster General's department decided that we can't have Bondi, you've got to come up with another name. Eventually they came up with the name Bond Beach. So my grandfather was part of that whole development of the Bondi Beach area. Great-grandfather on the Oliver side came out from Scotland as a very small boy, and he with his parents settled on the northern coast of Tasmania. They moved around over several years, but finally settled in the Latrobe and Devonport area. He was a furniture removalist, come carpenter, come teacher, bit of a jack of all trades. I found some interesting newspaper articles about his carrying business, and we're talking about horse and buggy days, not motorised vehicles. So dirt roads with horse and buggy. He had his own stables on the Mersey River in Devonport. It would have looked a lot different then to how it looks now. Being new to that trade in the Devonport area, he didn't know the roads so well, and he got fined a couple of times. Once for basically breaking some curbing, and another time, I believe, for being an unlicensed horse and buggy driver. So, interesting times. He also, when he was in Latrobe, offered to gravel some of the road that they lived in Sherwood. And at the beginning of one year, back in the 1890s, he was requisitioned to gravel this road and took up the task, took on the job. And later in that same year, there's another newspaper article saying we no longer require the services of Andrew Oliver because he hasn't fulfilled the task in the time frame that was set. And he's come up with, in the paper, there's recorded all sorts of excuses or reasons that he presented as to why that hadn't happened. But the good counsel that was operating in Latrobe at that time said, sorry, too late, too little done, and not quick enough, and we're going to get someone else to finish off the task. So it's really interesting back in the day about newspaper articles and how people reported on everyday events. It's a bit like social media of today. We get so concerned about people writing up stuff on Facebook and other social media sites about what they're doing day to day. But 100 years ago, all of that stuff was written in the newspaper. And it's just people moving here, there and everywhere, who they're visiting, who's been invited to your birthday. It's all there recorded. And you go to the Trove website, you can find out all sorts of really interesting, sometimes a bit weird, information about your own family.
This is the memorial for Ellen Murphy and George Mainwaring, two convicts who came out here from England and met up, however, and married, and are my great-great-grandparents.
Andrew Oliver's wife was born Ellen Mainwaring. Her mother and her father were both convicts, George Mainwaring and Ellen Murphy. George Mainwaring was a pretty decent convict. He only was transported for 7 years because he had pinched a pair of pinchers, fire pinchers. So he got 7 years for that. But his future wife, Ellen Murphy, was a bit of a street urchin on the streets of London, a bit of a Charles Dickens type character from Oliver Twist. You can imagine her being on the streets, pickpocketing, carrying on just like the Oliver Twist characters. She was caught for stealing a couple of pieces of denim cloth and several books. 2 different sentences, so therefore 2 7-year sentences. She was only 13 years old and she got 14 years, 2 transportation sentences to Tasmania. So they both ended up in Tasmania, George at Port Arthur, Ellen at the Cascades Female Factory in Hobart. George was very well behaved, didn't get up to any mischief at all. I don't think he even had to do his 7 years. He got his ticket of leave before that was all over. Ellen was a completely different story. She was quite a character, and I've been able to get a hold of her charge sheet, and 14 or more charges while she was incarcerated in Tasmania. She was going from one place to another while the authorities, I believe as best as they could, were trying to get her to become somebody who would be potentially a settler in the early days of Tasmania. But anyway, Ellen did not want to behave. The very first place that she went to was the Blacksmith's Arms Hotel, which is now called Epsom House in Pontville. This is where my great-great-grandmother first worked after being at the Cascades Women's Factory for however long, a year maybe. So it was called the Blacksmith's Arms back in 1832. Blacksmith's Arms Hotel or pub, and now it's called Epsom House, and operates as a reception centre. So it's really odd being here when my great-great-grandmother was about 15 years old. It didn't take Ellen very long to play up and misbehave, and she was sent back to Cascades. Over the 10 or so years that she was incarcerated, she moved to many places, always getting sent back to the female factories. She went from the Hobart Cascades, she went to then Georgetown, then sent to Launceston. So 3 different female factories, many different appointments with other settlers, always sent back to the female factory because of bad behaviour. She was sent into solitary confinement many times on bread and water. The last time, after about 10 years, she was given a full year of solitary confinement, which seems to have been the thing that has turned her around. So after that, it is registered that she was not suitable for this area. That's referring to Launceston. And they wanted to move her on. Best way to move her on was to get married. I don't think they were encouraged to get married, but she had requisitioned the authorities to twice get married, and with approval, but never carried it out. The third time, she either got lucky or she actually fell in love with the right guy, and that's where George Mainwaring came in. So she and George got married, and then they got their tickets of leave. So they got married when they were convicts. They then got their tickets of leave and settled down in the northern part of Tasmania, became pioneering farmers. And of course, the rest is history, so to speak, as they had their own children, Ellen Mainwaring being, I think the second daughter, who of course married my great-grandfather Andrew. Grandmother on the Oliver side of my family was born Edith Hayes. She was born in Burnie in Tasmania to her father John Hayes. John was the first mayor of the town or city of Burnie. He travelled to England as part of that role and represented the town of Burnie at the coronation, King George, I'm not sure who, but anyway, he was able to revisit his own family back in England at that time. John himself had a very large family, so Edith had lots of brothers and sisters, all in Tasmania. They eventually spread all over the country. One of the interesting sisters that Edith had lived in Canberra, and she even made the front page, or maybe her husband made the front page of the Canberra Times, because that particular part of the family were very strict, closed brethren. She in fact divorced her husband because he had a radio, and the church said, yes, on those grounds you are able to divorce your husband. Anyway, quite a story, pretty tragic for her husband. But anyway, getting back to my grandmother Edith and her father John, he went back to England to try and work out a bit of his history and catch up with family from the Malmesbury area in the southern part of the UK. What I've been able to discover is that this strict family, some of whom became the closed brethren, actually came from a background of brewing beer and of pub ownership. In the Malmesbury area, they owned 2 pubs. They had the Potting Shed and the Wheatsheath Inn, and they brewed their own beer and sold it. Of course, back in those days, you've got to remember that the water wasn't too good, so brewing beer was seen as a pretty good thing to be doing because you were keeping people healthy by serving them beer. So a bit of a different outlook, obviously, in those days than would be seen today, especially by the closed brethren. But anyway, for a guy who eventually became the Mayor of Burnie, he had quite an interesting background. My mum's side of the family are the Revilles and the Fairbrothers. The Revilles came from northern Tasmania again, mainly from the Penguin area, but my grandfather, Laurie Reville, once he had got married, lived in Latrobe. He was a baker, and they did quite well in Latrobe working for the Wells Company. He had a really good-looking motorbike, a Harley Davidson, that they used to get around in, and I believe later on obviously also had different early cars. The Revilles mainly came from Penguin. His father, Robert Reville, had a mining company, the Reville Copper Mining Company, with his own selection in the Dial Range just south of Penguin. I don't believe the mining company did that well, but he was obviously a bit of an adventurous spirit, and he had come out, that's Robert Reville, had come out from the Norfolk area of the UK on one of the many boats that all of these people came on, with his father, also Robert Reville. So we've got Robert Reville Sr., Robert Reville Jr. Laurie had a brother, Robert Reville, as well. There's Robert Revilles all over the place. It's very easy to get lost when you go researching. My grandfather, Laurie Reville, had many hobbies, the principal one of which was homing. That's training pigeons to fly off in a competition but to come home. He won many competitions in whatever category it was that he flew in. Sometimes he even made the Melbourne papers when they had features of interstate sporting events. The Revilles in general were also into homing, so when you go searching for the Revilles, you always pick up on all the homing events that they got up to. But Laurie was the main one in the family who did really well. My mother's mother was born Ada Fairbrother. I've never heard anything from my mother about the Fairbrothers other than she didn't like her grandfather, John Fairbrother. Well, what I've been able to find out online through British newspapers is that John's father, Joseph Fairbrother, was a gamekeeper in the Ashby de la Zouch area in central part of the UK. He died when he was 44, so he died young. He still managed to have 11 children though, before he was 44 years old. But anyway, his life was quite interesting as a gamekeeper. He worked for the Marquis of Hastings. They had 2 houses that they looked after, Donington Hall and Wellesley Hall. Wellesley Hall, but since been long demolished, but Donington Hall is still in existence and is actually now the headquarters of the Norton Motorcycle Company in the UK. Well, back in the day, back in the 1860s, Donington Hall, my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Fairbrother, is the gamekeeper, and he got caught cockfighting with the Marquis. They went to court. The Marquis is fined £5, obviously expected just to pay his bill. My great-great-grandfather, Joseph, is given the option of paying a £2 fine or spending 6 months in prison. I think he paid the fine somehow. So that's what happened in 1860. In 1864, 4 years later, he was, who knows what was going on with his gamekeeping. There's 2 different stories. One is that he was simply, after a long day, he went to the local pub and he was walking home along a train track that went through the area and was hit by the train. The second story is a much better story, and that is that he got into all sorts of trouble with keeping people off the Marquis's property and fell into bad company, got caught up in what we would probably now call gang warfare, and was actually killed by the gang and left on the train tracks. Unfortunately left in such a manner that his neck was over the track, and of course the train came along and off with his head. So my great-great-grandfather lost his head on the train tracks just outside Ashby-de-la-Zouch, looking after the Marquis of Hastings game. Very sad story. He'd had 11 children. His wife ended up with 12 children because there was another one already on the way, and the Marquis died soon after that as well, but his eldest sister inherited his properties, and she looked after my great-great-grandmother, and for about 40 years after that event she was given £10 a year to look after those children. And of course John Fairbrother, my great-grandfather, was one of those kids, and he actually went to America first, decided it was no good, came back to the UK and decided to come to Tasmania, where he found it to be a place worthy of settlement. That's the Fairbrothers. With all the shifting that my parents did in those early years, it ended up that I went to 4 different primary schools before I hit grade 1. I had quite a bit of getting to know new people, feeling a bit out of place, all sorts of disjointedness. Led to me being quite a self-conscious, introverted young guy, hitting grade 1 at Ashwood Primary School. At Ashwood I found friends, however, very easy to make. And I don't know what, I'd like to think that was about me, but I think it was also about the type of people who lived in that area. It was generally a housing commission area. I lived on one side of the road, the housing commission people lived on the other. All my friends were on the other. Had very few friends in the area that the immediate vicinity of where I lived. All my friends came from the housing commission. I got along really well with them. We had a great time doing all sorts of stuff. Back in those days, TV was not that common. We did not have a TV at our house. I used to go to my friend's house to watch TV, but we also had lots of hobbies and got up to all sorts of stuff after school. We were able to send away to the United States and get little rocket engines, and we designed and made our own rockets, and we used to go off every Saturday morning to ride out to the far suburbs of Ringwood and the like, to Ringwood Lake and the area around there, to various ovals, and we'd set off our rockets, and we had a great time doing that. We were totally into the whole sort of science fiction realms of, you know, what's going to happen, so we're into telescopes, rockets. Doctor Who, he was a big character that we all followed. And we got into astronomy, did all sorts of crazy stuff. We used to take all the heads off matches, and with the CO2 containers and a soda bottle, we used to make our own little bombs. We had a great time, and I'm not going to tell you now, but we had our own little formula for making bombs.
Where's the kaboom? There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom!
We became known, the general area guys became known as the Geordie Boys. Different from what most people now would call the Geordie Boys. I think there's even a band called the Geordie Boys. But back in the day, there was no Broadmeadows, there was no Frankston. Well, there was a Frankston, but it was a holiday destination back in those times. So the Broadmeadows type and the Frankston type of today, the Dandenong type, back in my day, it was the Geordie Boys. And those characters who I grew up with became gangland leaders, murderers, and many of them ended up in jail. So they were all my friends back in primary school, and we had a great time. I learnt many things. Hence, my parents did not enjoy so much me bringing those kids home. So it caused all sorts of difficulty between myself and my parents. Eventually it grew into this whole black sheep of the family thing that some people will be familiar with, and I didn't fit into well in the church life that my parents wished upon me. But I still had a very good time. I enjoyed myself. I was in the footy teams. I was in the footy team at state school. We became Eastern Zone premiers for the whole of Melbourne. We were in the final four of the whole of Melbourne. I was playing football with the young Barretts. Wes Barrett played for Richmond. His elder brother Billy Barrett was one of the famous all-stars of the Richmond Football Club. So they all grew up in that same area, and we enjoyed our sport. I was into bike riding very early on, and plenty of football, plenty of cricket. Another notorious character that I grew up with was Michael Hamill, and okay, I might not have got along so well with him in the early days, but by the end of high school we were very good friends, and he became later in life to be known as the guy who beat up Sam Newman because he pinched Sam Newman's girlfriend. And so Sam Newman had to have facial plastic surgery to cover up the scars from my mate Michael Hamill. Good times. At school, we were also encouraged to play a musical instrument. I took up the trumpet way back in year 8. It was something that suited what I liked doing. So I picked up the instrument very quickly, like it only took me weeks. And the teacher was quite astounded at how quickly it all happened. And along with other kids at the school, though, it was a day when everybody thought they could be a rock star. And it didn't take much to form a group and to get a bit known for your musical abilities. So we formed several groups within the school and even outside of the school. I also had learnt from a very young age to play the piano. So I entered those bands with the dual skills of being able to play a keyboard and to play the trumpet with a bit of singing. So we had a great time. We had a couple of people at school who down the track would become famous. We had the Men of Work, got a drummer, Jerry Spicer, and various other people. And it was just a great time to be involved in music, because as I say, everybody thought that you just put a bit of time into it and you'll end up on the TV somewhere. We had lots of concerts with Billy Thorpe and all sorts of other bands that we got to know and got to associate with. It was just a great time to be involved in music. I used the trumpet for many years after that, got involved in several other groups, mainly in church groups, but it just kept going year on, year out, and eventually even got conveyed to my children, who also took up musical instruments and had a great time in the whole area of music as well. Another thing that I enjoyed doing, which is probably seen as a bit darker these days, was that I used to go out with my dad shooting rifle. We used to shoot rabbits. And so a long history of shooting in the family. My grandfather was a great shooter. He, of course, would go out shooting kangaroos and whatever else. Even my grandmother would go out with them back in the 20s probably. They'd get out the back of Whyalla there in the bush and have their camps and get up to who knows what. So my grandfather, my father, then me, at Swifts Creek, where I eventually moved to years down the track, had the four-wheel drive, and we had a great time there. I even took my father out there a couple of times. And then later on after that, again, we went to America, and the kids learnt to shoot over there. So there's a whole history of guns and shooting in the family. Back when I was about 18, leaving school, getting towards the end of year 12, I felt very sick. I got glandular fever. Over many years after that, I would get this reoccurring thing, and it really inhibited what I could do. I had to repeat year 12, and I'd get these flu-like symptoms every year for about 10 years. It turned me into a bit of a character who it was a bit sickly, I suppose you'd have to say. But anyway, another thing that was going on at that time was that whole black sheep of the family. And I really wanted to move away from my parents and the whole scene of church and that established lifestyle that they wanted me to move within. I wanted to become a rock star. But anyway, I met and married Naomi, and we moved to Armidale, closer to Melbourne, back to that area where I had felt so familiar with as a young guy, and felt quite comfortable there. But work was interesting. I didn't sort of stay within the realms. I was stuck in an office out at Springvale for Trimview, and I wanted to move on. I was very restless, was not happy with that office lifestyle, and we moved to Swifts Creek. Have a look at that. Been 2 years married, and our first child, Luke, was born here. Amazing. And I remember one of the very first things I did was mow the lawns, and I clipped the pipe at the water meter, and I became very well known in the town because I was the new person who damaged the town water supply. I worked at the sawmill there, the Trimview sawmill, and I was to become a sawmill manager. Wow, look at this. 1976, this was a great big metal construction, and you can see two sheds are still here, the engineer's shed and I believe the old generator, but there was another behind it, was another big area which was the actual sawmill that I worked in. And then to the left here was all a very large timber yard with a great big sorting table, one of the biggest in Victoria I believe at the time, and we handled such a huge volume of timber. It's just incredible to remember what was going on compared with what we can see now. It's just so different. It's quiet. It was a noisy place. There was a huge fire furnace thing at the end where all the scrap was burnt, and there was smoke everywhere, and the noise from the actual mill was horrendous. Back in those days, no occupational health and safety. No one wore earmuffs except you know who, and I was very much boo-hooed back in those days for wearing earmuffs. Oh, Geoff, you just can't take it, can you? But yeah, I was trying to think of the future a little bit, and fortunately I can still hear a little because it was so bad, that noise, and earmuffs were in their very early days. So anyway, here we are, that's it. That is the Trimview Timber Mill site in Swifts Creek today. Wow. Working with Trimview had taken us to Swifts Creek, but it also took us beyond that because we came back to Melbourne, and I went back to the Springvale yard, which was really large. It was all part of Jennings Industries. They built lots of houses around Melbourne, but I got taught a whole heap of things about the building industry. Of course, my dad had been a builder for many years before that with his building partner, and I only was back in Melbourne from Swifts Creek a short while, and my dad, who was now in New Guinea, mentioned to me with letters and different times of talking that maybe I was interested in working with his old business partner, Dion Whitcomb. Eventually, that is what I did. So I left Trimview and I took up an apprenticeship with Dion, and for about 10 years I learnt the hands-on side of the building trade. We built lots of extensions and renovations and jobs all over the eastern suburbs, from Toorak to Glen Waverley and everywhere in between. Dion and my father were very old school in the way that they did their work, so they didn't rely so much on lots of different trades. They tended to do the work themselves. So unlike today where you learn a particular trade and you're stuck within that, I learned about 4 trades, and it was to my advantage over all the years that followed when I became a registered builder and taught my own son the same kind of stuff. When I was at Trimview, we had moved to a new house actually, in Avensley, and I lived there for about 7 years. So I was travelling all the way down to Springvale, and as time went on, 1983, along came the bushfires of Ash Wednesday. Fortunately, the fire burnt away from our house because it started right near us on a 43-degree day. It was just a terrible experience to go through, but we had to grab all the belongings that we could and put them into 2 cars and move out of the area. But we were close enough to actually watch the fire burn through Cockatoo, and I believe about 20 people died that night. But we were hearing houses explode, gas cylinders exploding. Daniel was only 1 year old, had 3 kids, and we only stayed in that house for another year. We eventually then moved to Cockatoo. Fires had been through, cleaned out Cockatoo pretty much, and the place was opened up for new development. We became one of those, and we bought a block of land and built our own mud brick house. It's quite a unique house and took many years to build. We had to live in a caravan for nearly 1 year on site. Because of the fires, we were given special permission to live in that caravan. So I'd work during the day, come home, and then I'd do another 3 or 4 hours on the house. It was an exhausting time. Ended up a 5-bedroom, 3-level mud brick house that we lived in for the next 30 years or so. The kids went to school at Mountain District Christian School, MODS, from there. For all of their primary years and most of their high school years. We'd progressed in churches from, I grew up at Chadstone Baptist, we went to, early on I went to Armidale Baptist, then of course we went to Belgrave South Baptist when we lived at Avensley. Then when we moved to Cockatoo, we decided to change denominations and we became Anglicans, which was a bit of an eye-opener, but it was, in those days we used to call it the lowest of the low in the Anglican Church way of talking about their denomination. And St Luke's at Cockatoo was a great little church where it was quite different to the structure of the Baptist Church. And the Baptists would say that the Anglicans are structured, well, being the lowest of the low, we could say that the Baptist Church was extremely structured compared with the free and easy way of doing church that we found at St Luke's. From there, we went to the Vineyard in America for a roughly 4-month stint at a ranch in California, north of Los Angeles. Met lots of really interesting people, lots of great people, and learned a lot about doing church in a very different manner than anything even St Luke's had been able to offer us. And we came back from America with our eyes wide open to potential that could happen, but a bit disappointed in what we struck back in Victoria, in Australia. It wasn't long before we decided that we would continue with the Vineyard movement, and we took the 3 kids to Russia with the idea of going for 4 years working with the Vineyard movement in Siberia. But we only ended up staying for 1 year, but what a year it was. I became the pastor of the church over there because all the Americans cleared out pretty much within 6 weeks of us arriving. We had Boris Yeltsin taking over from Gorbachev in Moscow. There was lots of political manoeuvring going on. It was a very interesting time, very challenging. I learnt so much. The black sheep of the family, who was introverted, was turning into quite a different person. I had to fulfill the role of being pastor of basically a very large youth group in Russia, having my kids being homeschooled or in Russian schools, dealing with a Russian language, dealing with people who had a lifestyle quite different, completely different to what we had been accustomed to for our whole lives. There were so many changes.
This actually is the beginning of the tramway which crosses the bridge and serves the other side of the river. This is the side of the river that we live on, not far from here. So you can see there's many people here waiting for a tram. There's only one tram here at the moment, and we don't know how long it will be before it takes off or starts. But we want to show you what it's like for them to get on a tram.
Can you describe your experience and your feeling about riding in the trams?
On the tram, when you first start, like from here, because it's the first stop, it's usually okay. But by the time you get across the river, or if you're on a bus trip, you're usually crammed, and I mean really crammed. You get to know people like you've never known, so many strange people in your life, and it's a unique experience.
It is not very comfortable to use trams here because you have to wait for half an hour.
What did you say now?
You have to wait for half an hour. You waste much time.
Uh-huh.
Вот ни на чем не уехать, сразу вот на такси и все, только деньги выбрасывай.
And when you are late for something, you have to use taxi. It's very, very expensive.
Hello, мы военнослужащие города.
We're in the army just, and we live in Krasnoyarsk at the moment.
Звали с города Минусинска, Красноярского края. Из города Владивостока.
Я с города Владивостока.
I'm from Vladivostok. I'm from Vladivostok to the east, from here, and I'm from he is from Minusinsk.
Спецчасть.
And this is special division, and we just guard and we are just security organs for special trucks. Well, you know, when trucks.
Is this like one of those special refrigerator factories?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, one of the special refrigerator
And will you
factories.
explain that, Joe?
Well, some of them are so special that they don't only make refrigerators.
When to be security guard with these trucks.
And we also have someone in our church who works at one of the refrigerator factories which also makes missiles. And they still do that now. So this is typical Krasnoyarsk tram, or a typical Russian tram. They're all over Russia. And as you can see, it's stopped. It's not working. We passed a whole heap of other trams earlier, and there's obviously a hold-up, there's a breakdown. So these people have been waiting 2 hours for a tram, and the only tram that they can take is this one, and it's also stopped. And actually there's another one coming in, so there must be a little bit of movement down the line.
I always say it was a bit of a vertical. You talk about a learning curve as you go through life. I had a vertical learning curve within 1 year. I had to become basically a different person.
Мистер Оливер, расскажите о цели вашего приезда сюда, в Богом забытый край, и почему вы выбрали именно Черемушки, Саяногорск?
We were invited down here by the people at the school here.
Сюда нас пригласили люди, работающие в школе.
Luke had been with us only 6 months. He had to come back and finish off his VCE. But Rachel and Daniel stayed on with us for the full 12 months. We went through a Siberian winter, basically learning to live inside your fridge's freezer. which is, I believe, only about -19, so we were down to -40. Came back to Australia and switched churches again, trying to find that whole vineyard feel, which was very difficult, it just did not exist here. I went to theological college, got a degree in theology, 3 years, full-time, did that, and the kids still at school, Luke starting off working on cameras, doing a intense TAFE course, led him into Channel 9. Rachel was still at school doing outdoor ed, into the army, and then into the police force. And Daniel left school, did his carpentry apprenticeship, got into building, eventually ended up back with me, building in Melbourne. So I did that 3-year table course, got my degree, but I ended up back in building, being the registered builder that I did for the next 20 years or so. We built several houses, we did lots of extensions and renovations, we developed our own bathroom style and stepless shower, which became very popular, and people were wanting their own stepless shower base after they saw what we could do, and we built many kitchens. We did all sorts of stuff. Because of the training that I'd had with Dion Whitticombe in that versatile style of building, we were able to do lots of projects that many other builders were incapable of, or if they were going to do them, they did a very expensive project. We were able to undercut them quite seriously because of the varied style of the skill base that we had. So I had a great time building. We used to go on all sorts of camping trips. One of them was right here on the Tambo River near Swifts Creek. The river flows through here and goes all the way down to the Gippsland Lakes. But we came here one summer and had several days, just camped over there, which is now private property, by the way. So we'll have a look down here, but it's just a fantastic area. We used to shoot the rapids on lilos, including me. We had great fun, and we, from the campsite up there, we'd walk up the river, up to the embankment, up the side here, and shoot the rapids up here, and then flow down and pick up where the tent was down further. We had a great time. There was lots of fun and frivolity, and you can imagine what was going on. It was the middle of summer, it was hot, it was great to get in the cool water, and just a great spot to spend a couple of days. We took our kids all sorts of places. We'd been to South Australia, we went up to New South Wales and Canberra, over to Coffin Bay, Adelaide, lots of camping trips around Victoria. We went to the Grampians, Wilson's Promontory, I can't even remember half the places, Wilpena Pound in South Australia, all over the place. We loved our camping trips. Part of those camping trips was often bike riding. In the early days we were on pretty primitive bikes, and things got a bit rough a few times. I remember we were at Wyperfeld National Park out on a ride, and Rachel at that stage we had a bike for everybody. I thought, although Daniel was on the back in a child's seat on the back of my bike, but Rachel went for a real big sixer, a big accident one evening at Wyperfeld, and nearly scared the living daylights out of me. But anyway, it ended well, but at the time it was pretty frightening. But all my kids learnt bike riding skills from all those events, and we used to do a lot of riding, many kilometres covered on our bikes. That continued on for me and my children as the years went by, and have done many trips since. And I myself have done lots of touring. I've done twice over Mount Hotham now. I've done Bairnsdale to Canberra and back to Bairnsdale. With Jenny, my wife, I've done the Great Ocean Road.
Yeah, great. We seem to be missing a lot of the showers.
Yep, we are.
goes a car, lots of cars and caravans and motorhomes, Winnebagos, all sorts of things. Everything under the sun in the way of camper vans. It's just an incredible road.
We're the only ones on bikes, aren't we?
It's raining at the moment. We're getting a bit fogged up and it's a bit difficult, but you can still see a fair way. And that's the road we've got to travel on. Well, we're leaving Lavers Hill early in the morning and it's quite windy, but I think the wind will be a benefit rather than a problem. And we've got about 50 k's ahead of us to get to Apollo Bay. So we're on the road again. I've been to South Australia and done the Limestone Coast. So lots of bike riding, thousands and thousands of kilometres. Back in the day, this was called the Omeo Highway, twisting and turning all the way up to Omeo. Now, of course, it's the Great Alpine Road. But in years gone by, I actually also went bike riding along here. And one of the bike rides, this was the first place I stopped while she was cutting. And I sat down on one of these rocks, or near one of these rocks, 20 years ago, something like that, and got myself ready for the ride ahead. The first big downhill ascent, which you'll all be able to watch. But first I've got to put a little bit of lippy on. Stop the lips from getting dried out. Forgot to put it on first thing. Without this, by the time I'm finished the ride, I'll be in agony. But it will fix all my problems. Okay, now for the downhill. As time went on, the kids started gaining their own experiences, growing up, just getting older. Eventually, Luke and Rachel got married. Daniel stayed at home a little bit longer, being 6 years younger than Luke, started working with me. And I also moved on in my relationship and I eventually got married to Jenny. We met at the Vineyard Church in Berwick and things just grew quite quickly once we got to know each other. Jenny had always been in nursing management and she continued on that career after we got married. I continued on in my building career. But it wasn't too long before things changed within the family again, in that Luke started to develop the idea of making a movie. And up until this stage, I'd been a very keen photographer. From a young age, I'd actually had a camera, an old Brownie Kodak camera, and I loved taking photographs. But that's all I had ever done. So I can remember back in 1966 being on top of the National Mutual building in the city and taking photographs of the city from way back then. So that developed over time and I took lots and lots of photographs. Ellendel's Secret comes along with Luke making his movie, and I need to change my skills from taking photographs to the whole idea of doing video myself. So I did the behind the scenes. I learnt a lot of things from Luke making the movie, and I picked up a lot of stuff for my own thing, making the behind the scenes type of movies. From that, I developed the whole thing because social media was in its beginnings then of Facebook, YouTube, and all sorts of other places, but particularly with YouTube, being its early days, I got in early, and in about 2008, I started my own YouTube channel. I had to create my own persona. And I started the whole Geoff Oliver, Jenny Oliver, GoJo media thing, which eventually became very popular. We did a lot of tourism type videos in the early days, particularly of stuff around Melbourne, freeways, became involved with guys in America with American freeway videoing. So I presented the Australian side of that and got accustomed to the idea of collaborating with other people. I got to the point where I had filmed all of Melbourne's videos and became known in America as the Australian video road guy. But then that all had to die out because I'd run out of freeways to video. So I needed to move on in
found out that I could do food reviews.
Drink it.
Rockstar juiced? Oh, wow! I'm loving it!
Got associated with another guy in Canada, Ken Domick, and together we started to develop a whole food review thing.
Geoff, a buddy of mine from Australia, from GoJo Media, check out his channel. I bought a shirt.
But working with Ken and then obviously on my own, I became Australia's most popular fast food reviewer.
Hey, I'm not a slacker. I'm getting the zinger stacker.
Now with over 7 million views and 13,000 subscribers, the channels have become very popular.
See you later.
Thank you very much.
And I need to branch out again actually, because I've tasted so many burgers and KFC chicken over the years. I need to do something else. But anyway, it has been a huge amount of fun, a huge experience, and even with Luke doing food reviews, it's just been loads and loads of fun.
We're a bit scared today. Stag chili from the Dynamite Bar.
So it's going to be hot on the way in. It's going to be hot on the way back out again.
The whole GoJo Media thing was very much tied to the Cockatoo house. Jenny and I decided to move, and along with that came a change in what I was doing. The GoJo Media thing started to fade out. We moved from Cockatoo to Bairnsdale. Part of that time also was a family change because my mother was now getting quite elderly, over 90 years old, and she soon passed away. My dad had passed away when I was 25 years old, and so 30 years later, my mum passed away. And then we moved to Bairnsdale. So a lot of changes happening over quite a short period of time. I also changed from being that registered builder and media kind of personality, and a bit of acting in there too. I'd been on Neighbours, Dr. Blake, so I'd done a bit of acting as well. So moving away from Melbourne to Bairnsdale meant that a lot of things had to change. And I took up a job as a maintenance manager with Japara, looking after maintenance in aged care. That all brings us pretty much up to date. We're now in Bairnsdale and settled down in a very nice little townhouse, so I don't have to whippersnip or brush cut a whole half an acre of grass anymore. And living on a steep block, we've got a nice little flat block with a tiny backyard, and grow some of our own vegetables. We're in walking distance to the shops. Life has really changed a lot for us recently. So it's been a very varied and interesting life so far that I have led. I'm looking forward to what may be down the track yet to come. But if it's like anything that has already been, there's still lots more adventures to experience.